Guys and gals. Yeah. Yeah, I know. When I say guys, I mean everybody. Okay. Did you guys have a good afternoon? All right. Thanks for coming back. Not everyone does. Thanks for having me back. Not everyone does. Well, I'm excited to be here with you guys. We had a good time this morning. We kicked off October Blast with a blast by declaring everything to be meaningless. So, that's, you'll have to listen to it if you weren't here to understand what I mean by that. So, I'm not going to do a whole lot of commercials or anything like that tonight. I just want to jump right in the name of saving time and getting you out of here at a decent hour. So, I want to kind of kick off the evening of October Blast with a similarly uplifting statement. God does not exist. Let me rewind and say that a little bit differently. There are places where God does not exist, but those are precisely the places where he is present, calling us to give him existence. There are places where God does not exist, but these are precisely the places where he is present, calling us to give him existence. So tonight and this morning, both of these messages I'm sharing are from my new book that's coming out at the end of this month, shameless plug. I have no shame. Shameless plug, but my book that's coming out at the end of this month called The Atheistic Theist, Why There Is No God and You Should Follow Him. So if you like this, check it out. You'll probably like that too. But so everything I'm sharing is on a certain theme, just so you know. So there are places where God does not exist, but those are precisely the places where he is present, calling us to give him existence. Now, that all sounds rather nebulous and purposely obtuse, and that's because it is nebulous and purposely obtuse. So what does it mean? Well, we'll get there, don't worry. But first, let's talk a little bit. In Cormac McCarthy's post-apocalyptic novel, The Road, the two main characters, simply called the boy and the man, are on this journey across the scorched earth to safer grounds. And they encounter this old man while on the road who calls himself Eli, and they have a little conversation with him. And in this conversation, this guy sort of spits out a bunch of statements that sound equal parts meaningless and meaningful, and you're not quite sure which they are, maybe both. But one of these statements really stuck out to me. In fact, it stuck in my soul like a blow dart, and just kind of, I couldn't get it dislodged. And it was simply this: the topic of God comes up in their conversation, and the old man, Eli, says to them, "Oh, there is no God." And they say, "Oh?" And he says, "There is no God, and we are his prophets." There is no God, and we are his prophets. Now, what could that possibly mean? That also sounds purposely obtuse and nebulous, and that's because it is. But what could this possibly mean? It could just be one of those statements that the philosopher Daniel Dennett calls a deepity, which is just a statement that sounds deep, but it isn't deep. It's just nonsense. Or there could be some depth to it, and I happen to think there is some depth to it. So what does it mean? Well, if you understand the background of the story, the backdrop in which this whole story is playing out, it's a post-apocalyptic setting. The earth is destroying itself, and humans are cannibalizing one another with the same degree of casualness with which we sort of nod at one another as we pass each other on the streets. You know, that sort of human nod, I'm a human, you're a human, that you just kind of, they're cannibalizing each other with that same degree of casualness. And so, of course, in a world like that, where everyone's lives have been touched by immense and intense suffering, it would be logical to conclude that there is no God, because how could God allow something like this to happen? And what this man says is that there is no God, and we are his prophets. Our suffering testifies to the fact that there is no God, because no God would allow such things to happen. So our suffering, the immensity and the intensity of our suffering, our prophets constantly declaring the oracles of a non-existent God. And I've got to admit that I came to a place in my own life, and I'm going to just share a little bit more tonight necessarily than preach like a ton of scriptures and everything like that. I'll get into all that, and we'll maybe talk some theology and philosophy and stuff like that too, but I want to talk a little bit more tonight and share some stories and stuff like that. We'll see where I go. I never know exactly where I'm going to go. But I have to admit that I came to a place in my own life where I had a similar experience to this, where the immense and intense suffering that I saw going on all around me became sort of anti-prophetic voices declaring to me the inexistence of God. I was a pastor for 11 and a half years, and you know, believe it or not, being a pastor, you see some stuff. I grew up in a pastor's home, and so I also saw some stuff there. And then I was a pastor 11 and a half years myself. And, you know, you get to know people. You get to know their stories. You get to know their hearts. You get to know that there's a lot of good, genuine, sincere people out there who suffer seemingly meaninglessly. And it's usually like the best people, too, isn't it? If you've ever had that experience, it's like the best people who always have the worst hands dealt to them. And you're always just like, what is up with that? That makes no sense. I remember this one little old lady who was her and her husband were the custodians at our church, and they were literally the greatest, best, nicest, most generous, prayerful, godliest people you've ever met in your life. And there wasn't a week that went by that something tragic did not occur to them. I mean, it was just constant. And of course, back in the day, there's some kind of curse in their family line that needs to be broken off. It's like, if anyone does not have a curse in their family line, it's this lady. She would have prayed it away 40 years ago. But here's the most sincere, godliest people that I've ever met in my life, and it just seems like one tragedy or another constantly befalls them. And I came to a point in my life where the constant suffering all around me began to literally testify to me of the inexistence of God, because how could God exist in the midst of all of this? I remember when we buried within like a month, when I was a pastor, 2 individuals who were the godliest people, again, you would ever meet in your life, both of whose healings were prayed and fasted for with ferocity, believed for with ferocity by yours truly and hundreds of others. There wasn't a lack of faith. There wasn't a lack of prayer. There wasn't a lack of agreement on their part or any of the little things we could say, well, that's what went wrong and that's what went wrong. None of that was lacking. It was all present, and yet they died. Like 50 years old, kids, just gone. And it happened like so fast. It was like they get the diagnosis, and by the end of the month, they're just shells of their former selves, and then they're gone. And I was there watching the one man die, like trying to pull his son to himself and trying to tell him, like, I love you, keep the family together, don't let, and I'm just sitting there like, I'm a pastor. I'm supposed to be man of the hour, full of faith and power. But in that moment, I didn't give a crap about being man of the hour, full of faith and power. I didn't want to throw 2 submissive hands into the air and say, oh, blessed be the name of the Lord. I wanted to throw 2 birds in the air and say something else about the name of the Lord. Yeah, right. Sure. I'm like, oh, it's terrible. It is terrible. It's fine. That's being a human being. If you can't talk to God like that, you don't know God. Well, I won't say you don't know him, but maybe you don't know him like you should, because you can talk to God like that. He can handle it. And if he can't, he's a wimp. Toss him. And I just came to this point. I'm like, there's no sense in all of this. I heard one too many stories about, I lost my car keys and I prayed and I found them magically. And then a week later hearing a story about a teenager who, with a bright future in front of them, who gets in a car accident because someone's not watching where they're going. And it's like, if you've got a God who magically directs you to your car keys or magically makes your car keys reappear, why isn't he using that same mojo to hide the car keys of the person who took this young teenager's life? Yeah, right. Yeah. Right? Yeah. I mean, I remember leaving to go speak one night, and my wife was out of town, and so I was taking the kids with me, and they were just being rascally, a little more rascally than normal this night. And they just wouldn't get ready, and they were just being really disobedient. And I'm like, come on. And so we were running a little bit late, and so they get themselves ready finally, and we get out the door, and I had lost the keys too, and I couldn't find the keys, and I found them at the last minute. And so we're heading out the door. We're going to be late at this point. And as I'm standing on the porch, I hear a car accident happen on the road that's just like a couple blocks outside of my subdivision, and I hear it. It's loud, it's scary. You know, it's going to be an ugly scene when we drive past it. And I had this thought go through my mind, like, maybe my kids were disobedient and I couldn't find my keys so that I could avoid being in that accident. And then I'm like, what the heck? No. If God is involved enough in that way to move my children to disobey and be really bad, why didn't he just move these people to stay home? And if he moved my car keys from A to Z, why not move the cars from A to Z to help avoid the accident? I mean, I'm just saying, eventually I just came to the point where I'm like, I can't believe in this God who does things this way. And this constant suffering and the meaninglessness of it all, though it elicited that Solomonic cry for me like we looked at this morning of why should the foolish and the wisdom and the wise die the same way and go to the same place? That's meaningless. Eventually, I came to that same point, that there is no God. And in this suffering, these are his prophets, testifying to his inexistence. Now, mind you, I wasn't a teenager going through a rebellious phase, trying to kick against the God or the religion of my parents. I was a pastor.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Every good pastor has gone through an atheistic phase, even if he wouldn't call it that, because good pastors are thinkers and they're prayers and they don't just. And you know what? It's actually good when pastors are willing to tell you that, because we put people on pedestals and we imagine them as being gods. And we imagine when they're in their office, and come out just before worship, we imagine that they're in there just communing with Jesus face to face. And it's like God himself is there in the room with them in a physical form. And they're just sitting across from him at the desk, like getting, words of knowledge for the service today and everything like that. It's like, no, dude, we're in there trying to make sure we're going to be able to pay our mortgage on Monday. It's like there are no superheroes, there are no superhumans. Those type of people do not exist. So rest in that knowledge and know that it's okay to be human.
Yeah. Right. There you go.
Yeah. Epicurus, the Greek philosopher, says this: is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence comes evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? I came to a point where that made a whole lot of sense. Sam Harris, one of the most prominent and popular atheists of our day, a philosopher, a neuroscientist, brilliant man, has written some incredible books, even though he's an atheist. I think the new atheist movement is sort of an unwitting prophetic ally of the modern church, because they're willing to do the work of deconstruction that we're not willing to do because we can't, because we're too invested. And they don't hold our fundamentalist views of Christianity sacred, so they just break them apart in front of us and be like, here's the crap you believe. And we're like, oh, that is crap. But I couldn't have smashed it the way you did, so thanks for doing it for me. But Sam Harris said similarly to Epicurus, either God can do nothing, and I believe this was in a debate with William Lane Craig, I think, but he says, either God can do nothing to stop catastrophes, or he doesn't care to, or he doesn't exist. God is either impotent, evil, or imaginary. Take your pick, but choose wisely. I came to a point where this made a lot of sense to me. Because I wasn't willing to just lie to myself anymore and just sort of like stuff the apologetical arguments like cotton into my ears and say, la, 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 I can't hear it. I could no longer drown out the sound of the anti-prophets prophesying the inexistence of God, and I just had to listen to them and take in what they were trying to say to me and feel it. And I felt it. And for a season, I was plunged into this place where I didn't even know if I believed any of this anymore. And I didn't want to believe any of it, because it would have been easier for none of it to have been true than to have tried to make sense of it all. Eventually, and this is long story short, and I won't give you all the gory details, but I was led back to the gospel. Why? Some would say. Why, after having kind of let it go, would you be brought back to it? Well, I can't help but be brought back to it. It's who I am. Okay? And so I was drawn back to the person of Jesus. No matter how many times I've tried, the person of Jesus intrigues me and draws me magnetically back to himself. And so I came back to the cross, and in the cross I began to see answers to these problems I was having. Now, I'm not saying I've discovered the answer to the problem of evil or the problem of suffering or the theodicy. I don't think there are answers to those questions. And I think we just need to accept that and move on and stop trying to be snappy, catchy little apologists, because the arguments of apologists just kind of don't work. No atheist takes them seriously. No secularist takes them seriously. Anytime those debates happen, it's just sort of like this session of masturbatory grandstanding where we just kind of stimulate ourselves and we cheer for our guy, but nobody out there is actually taking it seriously. But the people who want to believe already, right? So we just need to kind of accept the fact that there really are no answers to some of these questions. So I'm not saying I figured that out, because I haven't, but what I have found is in the cross something that speaks directly to this place, and at least it spoke to me when I was in that place and brought me into something new. And I want to share that with you tonight. So let me read this quote to you from a liberation theologian named Franz Hinkelammert. With a name like Franz Hinkelammert, you better have something good to say, right?
That's right.
So dear Franz, Hinkel, or Mert as he's known on the streets, says this: the absence of this mutual recognition, and when he says mutual recognition, what he means is when there is an absence of mutual recognition among humans that the other matters and that the other has value. When that is lacking, when there isn't a mutual recognition that the other matters, when one places themselves above the other, okay, so when there is no mutual recognition that the other matters, he says this becomes, let me just say it this way, the absence of this mutual recognition, which I just explained, between human beings is present in the poor. And in liberation theology, poor doesn't just mean impoverished, like no money. It means anyone who's suffering from oppression, anyone who's being unjustly trampled upon, oppressed, marginalized, or whatever. So he says, whenever there isn't a mutual recognition among subjects that the other matters, you will see this present in the poor. You will see this present in those who are being oppressed. Okay. According to liberation theology, he goes on to say, God is present wherever this acknowledgement occurs. So in his thinking, God is, and philosophers speak of God in these terms, that the philosopher John Caputo speaks of God in these terms, and we'll bring that up a little bit later, but God is spoken of in terms of an event. Yes, you can understand God as being an actual being, and that's the way we tend to understand God, as sort of like a big person up there who looks a lot like us, but just a lot bigger, right? But for many theologians, many philosophers, God is something that happens. When we live a certain way in this world, God happens. So when there's mutual recognition between subjects that the other matters, God is present, at least in Hinkelammert's thinking, and in the thinking of many liberation theologians. When I acknowledge your value, when you acknowledge mine, when I stop trying to shush the Black Lives Matter movement by saying all lives matter and just simply join them and say, yeah, you're right, Black lives do matter, and we've lived in such a way that we've made you feel like it doesn't. I don't need to be included.
Right. Yeah.
Because I've been included always. When we won't, you don't make a lot of friends saying that, because we white people who are extremely privileged don't like to think in terms of having ever done anything wrong. We don't want to acknowledge that we do have anything up on anyone else, but we do. And so this is a perfect example of what he's talking about here. There is, in this whole issue, an unwillingness on the part of white Americans to even say Black Lives Matter. Have you seen that? No, it's all lives matter. Duh, everybody knows all lives matter. The mattering of your life has never been in question. Right? It's never been in question. Now all this group is asking you to do is come alongside and acknowledge that they do too. Someone else getting the same rights as you doesn't mean you're being deprived of anything, right? So just acknowledge it. Yes, they acknowledge you matter, you acknowledge they matter, and in that mutual recognition that the other matters, in a sense, God is present. God happens in that recognition. We're affirming the image of God in the other person, and God happens. God is present wherever this acknowledgement occurs. The fact that this has not happened demonstrates a human relationship bereft of God, or absent, where God is absent. The existence of the poor, and again, that just means the oppressed, the existence of the poor attests to the existence of a godless society. Whether one explicitly believes in God or not, this absence of God is present wherever someone is crying out in oppression. The absence of God, I love this line, the absence of God is present in the poor. The poor are the presence of the absent God. What Hinkelammert is saying here is wherever there is an unwillingness to affirm that the other matters. That's a relationship bereft of God. God is absent from that relationship, not like God's not everywhere. I'm not speaking in those terms. But there are no godlike qualities in that relationship. God is absent from that relationship. That's a relationship bereft of God. And when someone suffers because of my inability to affirm them and to declare and show and live as though they matter, and they suffer and they become oppressed because of that lack of mutual recognition, they become what a liberation theologian would call the poor, or they're trampled upon, they're oppressed. And the presence of such people are the presence of a God who is absent. They are reminders to us that God is absent from this place and from this relationship. There are places where God does not exist. Wherever there are broken and fractured relationships because we refuse to acknowledge the other's mattering, God does not exist in that relationship. And the very presence of that broken relationship is the presence of a God who is absent. There are places where God does not exist. Now, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but these are precisely the places where he is present. These places where he is absent are precisely the places where he is present. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that God is a God who has distinguished himself as one who always stands with victims of injustice, with the oppressed, with the marginalized, with the otherized, to those whom we've pushed outside of the circle. God has forever defined himself as one who stands with those whose mattering we refuse to acknowledge. Think, for example, of the Babylonian exile. Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is destroyed, and many are carried off into exile, become slaves in Babylon. And Psalms 137, verses 1 through 6, the psalmist says, I'm just going to read to 4, verses 1 through 4. The psalmist says, by the rivers of Babylon, speaking of their time in exile. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. And on the willows there we hung up our harps. For there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. But how can we sing the Lord's song, that's capital L-O-R-D, Yahweh? How can we sing the songs of Yahweh in a foreign land? So here they are in this broken relationship, where there's this refusal to acknowledge the mattering of one, that we both matter equally, because one group is enslaved. And here they find themselves in exile in a foreign land. And the belief in antiquity is that if your city is destroyed and you're taken captive, your God does not come with you. Okay, so in a henotheistic, a polytheistic, and a henotheistic society, polytheistic meaning you believe in many gods and you worship many gods, henotheistic meaning you believe in many gods, but you worship one of those many gods. Jews at this time, many Jews were henotheistic at this time. Monotheism starts to develop. It's hard to say exactly when, but we see the development during the period of the exile. So, but here we have this view reflected where when you are taken from this place and planted somewhere else, your God does not come with you. How can we sing the songs of Yahweh when we're in a foreign land? How can we sing his songs in a place where he is not? In their understanding, Yahweh is still back in Jerusalem, still in that smoldering temple, but he's not with them in exile. But then Ezekiel has this vivid vision in Ezekiel 10 and 11, where he sees the injustices going on in the temple, and this is while they are in exile. And he sees the glory depart from the temple. The glory of God departs from the temple and makes its way east toward the captives. And on the other side of this, Ezekiel finds himself by the Spirit back among the captives, and it seems that we are to assume that God himself has made his home now among the captives. What happens here? What happens is that we see their understanding of God beginning to change. Right? They find themselves in exile in this place where God is not, and then God reveals himself as one who is standing with those who find themselves in a relationship that is bereft of God. There is no God in this relationship, but that's precisely where God is, because God always stands with victims of injustice and oppression. Now, we like that kind of talk until those victims are gay or something like that. We like that kind of talk until the Pulse shooting, where the victims are people that we can't imagine God is possibly standing with. We'll just let you think about that without talking about it anymore. But God is always standing with the otherized, with the victimized, and with the marginalized. And though this is a relationship that is essentially the presence of an absent God, it's also a declaration that God is here. Wherever there are people crying out, Hinckley-Lambert says, it's an absence of God. But that cry that testifies to the inexistence of God or the absence of God, like there is no God and we are his prophets, that same cry indicates exactly where it is that he is present. Now we find this cry throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. And the first place we find it is in the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis chapter 4. Remember, Cain rises up against his brother Abel and he smites him, he kills him, takes his life. And God comes and he says, listen, I hear the voice of your brother's blood crying to me from the ground. This is the first place we find this cry. Abel's blood crying, this victim of oppression, this victim of a relationship in which the mattering, one matters over the other. Yeah. And where there's not this mutual recognition that the other matters. Yeah. Abel becomes the victim of such a relationship. And it's godless in that sense. And yet, God hears this cry and stands, in a sense, with Abel. We find this cry appear again in the book of Genesis, in Genesis 18. Where these two angels make their way to Sodom in order to see what? If the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah matches what's actually going on. Now, we hear that and we typically just think that means God's like, oh, I hear a lot of bad stuff going down there and it sure sounds gay. And that was why Sodom and Gomorrah was judged, because of homosexuality. That's nonsense. That's not scriptural. Ezekiel tells us what the sin of Sodom was. Okay, it was that they overindulged in pleasure. They refused to help the poor. That was the sin of Sodom. Okay, later writers came to think of the sin of Sodom as being purely sexual in nature, but that wasn't the sin of Sodom as far as the writer of Genesis understood it, or as the later prophets understood it. What's the actual sin of Sodom? Read the text. In Genesis 18. God and two angels in the form of three strangers come to Abraham's encampment and are welcomed by Abraham with open arms. He provides them with shelter, he provides them with food and water and cares for their needs. Okay? After having been cared for by Abraham, these two angels set out to Sodom to see if the outcry against Sodom matches what's actually going on there. And these same two angels who are welcomed and treated hospitably by Abraham are welcomed in quite the opposite way by the citizens of Sodom. They try to gang rape them and dominate them, and the gender thing doesn't even matter here. The problem is what they were doing to outsiders who come within their city walls. And so the contrast is supposed to be made between how these same individuals are treated by Abraham versus how they're treated by Sodom. The outcry that had risen to God was the outcry of Sodom's victims. They were victimizing the guests who come within their city walls. And this cry of victimization rose to God. Same cry that Abel cries out. Same word, here again. We find it again in Exodus when the children of Israel groan in their slavery, and it says their cry rises to God. Again, same cry. In each of these instances, every time there's this cry, God is standing with the one crying. The cry itself comes from a godless place. The cry itself comes from a relationship that is bereft of God. And yet, these are precisely the ones with whom God is standing. The absence of God indicates the presence of God. There are places where God doesn't exist, but these are precisely the places where he is present. Yeah. Where there's a broken relationship and you can look at it and you say, there's no God going on in that relationship. God is actually there, standing with the victims. Yeah. You guys still with me? Yeah. In Isaiah 5:7, we read this, again of this same cry. God looks to Israel and it says, he expected justice, but he saw bloodshed. Righteousness, but heard an outcry. Nahum Sarna, writing in his commentary on Genesis, says, an outcry is the negation of justice and righteousness. That wherever there is this cry, there is an absence of God, according to Hinckley-Lambert. Wherever there is this cry, it's the negation of justice and righteousness, which are character qualities of a God who is love. Wherever there is someone crying out from this godless place, it's the negation of justice and righteousness. It's the absence of love. It's an absence of God. And yet those are precisely the places where you will find God standing with the victims of godlessness. This cry reappears Only this time it reappears in the person of Jesus. In Matthew 27:46, we find Jesus a victim of Roman crucifixion, a victim of a relationship that's all askew and jacked up, where there's not mutual recognition between subjects that the other matters. Therefore, there is an absence of God. And in this place where Jesus is unjustly murdered, it's a lynching. In this moment, we find Jesus doing what? Crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, we know Jesus isn't literally forsaken of the Father here. Jesus says twice in the Gospels that when you lift up the Son of Man, my Father is not going to leave me. We know Jesus isn't literally forsaken by the Father here. That old understanding that Jesus becomes sin and God's eyes are too pure and virgin to look upon Jesus while he's carrying our sin, it's nonsense. That's not what's going on when he cries this cry of, my God, why have you forsaken me?" What's going on when Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" is that he is joining himself to the godless. He finds himself in this place of godlessness where there's been a break in relationship, where his mattering isn't being acknowledged by the powers that be. And he finds himself in the same place that all godless victims find themselves. And he cries out from that place, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He joins his cry to theirs. He becomes like his brothers in every way, the writer of Hebrews says. Listen, omniscience demands that God know what it feels like when he doesn't exist. In order to be truly omniscient isn't just to know everything. It's to know as everything knows. And the way we imagine God is that God's just already omniscient and he has it all and he can't learn anything, he can't grow, he just is. But what if everything that God is, he already is, but we're sort of watching that play out in linear time? And God's brought us along for the journey. And what if his omniscience includes what he, in a sense, learns in the incarnation? The writer of Hebrews tells us because of what he suffers, in becoming like his brethren in every way, he's become a merciful and faithful high priest. How can I am become anything? Maybe we're watching the I amness of God play out, and it's complete outside of linear time, but maybe we're watching it unfold. Part of the journey of omniscience is that it's not just knowing everything, it's coming to know everything as everything knows everything. And that means Jesus puts himself in the place of the godless, in the place of the one who suffers and feels there is no God. And right now I am his prophet. And this cry testifies to the fact that there is no God. Jesus puts himself there. God, think about that, man. That God, sometimes it's easy to feel so distant from God. I was sitting out on my porch the other night looking up at the stars. Literally stars that might not even be there anymore. I'm looking at the light that left those stars, God knows how many millennia ago. May not even exist anymore. That may just have been how they existed millennia ago, whatever. And it's easy to look at those things and you feel so distant from them. And then you consider the fact that there are atoms in my left hand that I might share with that distant star. And there's atoms in my right hand that I might share with this star over here, because we literally are made of the same things the stars are made of. And then all of a sudden, that gap is closed a little bit. We don't seem quite so distant, because even though there's this great space between us, we're made of the same stuff. And then you think of God, and it seems like there's such a chasm, such a gap between you and him. And then you realize that in the incarnation, both God, that star, and you are made of the same stuff. And that gap is closed, and you realize we're literally in the incarnation. We're all connected. And then you realize it's not just like a substantial thing where God literally becomes of the same substance that humanity is, while being of the same substance that he literally, on an emotional level, becomes connected to us by experiencing a negation of himself, by experiencing a moment of suffering that feels like godlessness. where he literally cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, the first thing that's going on here is when he cries this out, if you sort of smush the narratives together, which isn't always a wise thing, but in this instance, I think I'll just make it work. If you kind of smush the gospel narratives together, Jesus cries this out, right? My God, why have you forsaken me? And then he gives up his spirit with a loud cry, and it says in that moment, the veil in the temple is rent from top to bottom. Now, we often think when the veil is rent from top to bottom, that's sort of God saying, like, hey, you know, guys, daddy's kicked his wrathaholicism, so it's safe to come back over because of what just happened on the cross. So you can come back over to dad's house now. He's at a better place. That's not what this means. When the veil is torn from top to bottom, what happens is it's revealed that there is no God in the system. The ark had been gone for a very long time. There was no glory behind the veil. You didn't want to go behind this veil. There was nothing there. And the tearing of the veil simply revealed that there was nothing there. And then at the same time, when Jesus cries out this loud cry, at the same time the temple veil is torn, we're told in one of the other narratives what that cry may have been, and it was, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. So Jesus cries out that he's forsaken, and then it's revealed there's no God here in this relationship, and there's no God here in this system. Jesus is the victim of godlessness in that sense. And yet, though God is not here, he's also there. He's close enough for the Son to commit his spirit into the Father's loving hands. The cross is a place where we can see both the inexistence of God and the existence of God coexisting. We see both the presence and absence of God on display here. So one, we're seeing the bankruptcy of a system, and we're seeing this broken relationship that is godless. But at the same time, we're seeing God being baptized into the trauma of the human experience, and literally himself taking on the emotion of godlessness. That, I mean, in your worst moment, in that moment where I'm like, there is no God, this suffering is the prophet declaring his inexistence. In that very place is something sacred because God himself in Jesus is made of that stuff. Even in that place where I feel more distant than I've ever felt before. No. God and I, even in that moment, are made of the same stuff. Even that place where I'm disavowing God is a sacred place. There's literally nowhere I can go that I'm not in his embrace.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Let me read this to you from Dietrich Bonhoeffer from, Bonhoeffer comes later, from G.K. Chesterton, from Orthodoxy. He says, in the terrific tale of the Passion, there is a distinct emotional suggestion that the author of all things, in some unthinkable way, went not only through agony, but through doubt. It is written, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. No, but the Lord thy God may tempt himself. And it seems as if this was what happened in Gethsemane. In a garden, Satan tempted man, and in a garden, God tempted God. When the world shook and the sun was wiped out of heaven, it was not at the crucifixion, but at the cry from the cross, the cry which confessed that God was forsaken of God. So let the atheists themselves choose a God. They will find only one divinity who ever uttered their isolation, only one religion in which God seemed for an instant to be an atheist. When God himself is baptized into the trauma of godlessness, everything that you could ever possibly be composed of is joined to God. That of which the most distant star is composed of, and that of which your nearest star is composed of, is what God is composed of. And that's mind-blowing to me. So what we see here, anyways, is that in the cross, God is absent, but God is present, because he's standing with Jesus. And yet he's absent in the sense that Jesus is experiencing this thing of forsaken. Let me pause for a second and just say this. Why does Jesus choose to sing Psalms 22:1 when he could have just as easily sung Psalms 22:24? What's 22:1? My God, why have you forsaken me? What's 24? He hasn't forsaken me. He's listened to my cry for help. He's not turned his face from me. Which one was more theologically accurate? 24. According to Jesus' own words. So why does he choose to say verse 1 instead of verse 24? It's opened the door for a whole lot of confusion. We've created whole doctrines out of his quotation of verse 1. So why just close the door? Why not just close the door on confusion and testify to the truth? Because Jesus in this moment is being a human. He's joining himself to humanity, and in so doing, he's giving you permission to be human as well. He's not empowering you to overcome your humanity. He's giving you permission to be a human yourself. There was a much more theologically accurate song he could have sung, but he chose to sing that which did not actually reflect upon the reality of the situation. He sang out of where he was. He sang from his gut. You know, if you ever hear the stories of how great hymns were written, Amazing Grace, of course, John Newton, the slave trader, and, you can understand then why, it's who saved a wretch like me. I mean, it's like this man was coming from this place where he truly felt like a wretch, truly did some wretched things. You understand the story behind it. You understand the content a little bit. And or what's the, It Is Well With My Soul, which was written like when a guy like literally lost his whole family at sea. And he writes this song in response, It Is Well With My Soul. I mean, these songs that have such beautiful stories behind them that bring out the power of the song itself. Let me tell you about a song that doesn't have quite as cool of a story behind it. You ever hear the modern worship chorus, Healer? I believe you're my healer. I believe you're all I need. I believe you're my portion. You ever heard that song? Do you know the story behind that song? This song was written by a man named Michael Guglielmucci. Now, much like a person with the name Hinkelammert, if you better have something to say if your last name's Guglielmucci. But Mr. Guglielmucci, old Googs as he's known on the streets, said he writes this song apparently in response to the fact that he's dying of stage 4 cancer, and he's just not going to let go because he believes God is going to heal him. And this video of him goes viral, singing it on stage in front of thousands with hooked up to oxygen and all this kind of stuff. And it's just this picture of a man who's at the end of his life, and yet here he is declaring that God is his healer. Whoa, what an inspiration, how moving. No wonder it went viral. No wonder millions were made off of that song. But it later comes out that he didn't, in fact, have cancer. That he'd been lying to his wife, to his mother, to his father, to his pastor, to his church, to the world, because he began to experience mystery symptoms that he thought was probably linked to the fact that he had a lot of sexual dysfunction. He was a sex addict and had a lot of things and behaviors he was engaging in behind the scenes that I've never heard him fully disclose what they were. But he'd been engaging in certain behaviors from his youth, and he'd never been able to be upfront or honest about these things. He'd never been able to actually tell anyone because his father's this bigwig pastor. Now he's this bigwig worship leader. You can't really just come out and talk about those issues when you're in a position like that because you lose your position. And so he begins to experience these mystery symptoms, shortness of breath, his hair starts falling out, and rather than sing the song that he needed to sing, he sang a different song. He makes up this elaborate story about having cancer. And it translates into a song that has very cliche lyrics, all the words that rhyme, all the kind of stock phrases you throw out. If you want to write a worship song, throw G, E minor, D, C in there, maybe an A minor 7 and climb up for the bridge or something like that. And, just a typical worship song and very, very typical, very, very cliche. And because this was the song he was made to sing because he couldn't sing the song he needed to sing. The song he needed to sing was, I'm a sex addict, I'm broken, and I need healing. But he covered it over with another song. And it looks exactly like what fake songs look like and sound like. And I think for years we've followed a Jesus who doesn't let us sing the song we need to sing. He sings verse 24 even when he feels verse 1. Yeah. And so we're those who constantly walk around singing verse 24 even though we're in verse 1. And what we need to sing in that moment is, my God, why have you forsaken me? You might know full well you're not forsaken, but you might feel it. And in that moment, you don't need to speak faith and say, oh, it's Friday, but Sunday's coming. Oh, I know I'm dying on the cross, but I'm about to catch resurrection up in here. Like we used to have to tell as kids, if you were sick, you couldn't even say you were sick. You had to say, I'm catching divine health. You couldn't even just speak honest words because somehow those words are magic, and when you speak them, demons come and grab them and afflict you with whatever it was you spoke into existence. Guys, do you have any idea how pagan that type of thinking is? How magical that type of thinking is, and not in a positive sense, not in a positive way? Absolutely pagan. But you couldn't even speak truth because God doesn't do that kind of stuff. He's always, he's always speaking resurrection where there's death, and he's always speaking this where there's that. On the cross, the place where God defines God's self, God sings a theologically inaccurate thing about himself and his own circumstance. I'm forsaken of God. How can you be forsaken of God? Dude, you are God. But in that moment, that's what he feels. And so he sings from that place of godlessness and God-forsakenness, forever giving us the permission to be human in moments of suffering and not to try. We don't have to try to be these righteous little robots who always say the right things and do the right things. You can say the song, you can sing the song you need to sing in a moment like that. You don't have to sing the song that will please the crowd and sell albums. You don't have to sing verse 24 if you feel verse 1. Sing verse 1. Because Jesus sang verse 1. Anyways, that was for free. I didn't really intend on going there, but man, religion robs you of the right to be a human being. It really, really does. And one of the beautiful things that God does in Jesus is he refuses to be God. In Philippians chapter 2, we read of the kenosis, of the emptying of Jesus into a human form and his unwillingness to cling to and hold on to the things we think of when we think of the divine. He lets them go and he sets them aside and he embraces the form of a man, becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And then we're told what? Then in response to this, we talked about this morning, but in response to this, God gives to Jesus, the Father gives to the Son, the name that is above every other name. And we're like, well, that name that's above every other name is the name of Jesus, because it says in the next line that at the name of Jesus, every knee bows and all this kind of stuff. So the name above every other name is Jesus. But Jesus was like one of the most common names in that period of time. That would be like saying, Bob or something today is the name that's above every other name, and 20 of them. Jesus was an extremely common name. The name that's above every other name to a Jew would be the sacred, unspeakable name of God. YHWH, we say Yahweh. That's the name that's above every other name. Laurent Schultz says a name that's above every other name defies, categories. It's a name that's above every other name. It's not even necessarily just a name as much as it is like a category that defies being categorized. It's the name above every other name. And in response to the Son's, who is God's, unwillingness to be God, and I say that figuratively, of course, but his refusal to be what we think of when we think of God's, the Father gives to the Son the name that's above every other name, and then says, now at the name of Jesus, every knee bends. But the name that's above every other name is Yahweh. You can't say Yahweh without saying Jesus. And you can't say Jesus without saying the unspeakable, unpronounceable name of God. God, the unspeakable name, is now forever conflated with one of the most commonplace names. God has conflated himself with the commonplace and with the ordinary, with the dirt and the grit and the bones and the blood of what it is to be a human being. That God's not found on a ziggurat atop the Tower of Babel. God is found in the grit of living and being.
Yeah. That's right.
So, in the cross, we have Jesus himself joining the godless, showing us once and for all that where you hear the cry of godlessness, this cry that comes from a place where God does not exist, those are the precise places where God is present. But he's present, calling for us to bring him into existence. What do I mean by that? Don't worry, I'll tell you. Let's go to 1 John. 1 John chapter 4. Sam Harris, again, says, knowing that there is no God means that it falls to us to make the world a better place. This is coming from the perspective of a man who is an atheist, a literal atheist, not an ironic atheist or an atheistic theist or something like that, like the term I use. But still, there's power in that statement. That realizing that there is no God means that it falls to us to make the world a better place. See, I don't think the God who is the God that we want. I don't. I don't think the God who is the God that we want. We want a superhero God who is a part of the Avengers on the weekends and the Justice League during the weekdays, and who always is busting through the walls like the Kool-Aid man at the last minute. When everything's about to go to crap, he breaks in at the last minute in order to save the day. Who never allows anything to occur or to touch you that will make you the slightest bit uncomfortable, squeamish, but the problem is, several 100,000 years of human existence have shown us that God doesn't exist like that. And we can think we're going to be the one generation who discovers a God who does exist like that. But the next generation is going to be trying to do the same thing, and they're going to be speaking of us as the ones who didn't do it either. See, I don't think the God who is the God we want. Because the God we want, again, is the God who exists in a certain form. Dietrich Bonhoeffer called this God the Deus Ex Machina God. That is the God who, this is a term from antiquity, it's a theatrical term. Whenever there was a problem that was insoluble that needed to be solved, one of the ways they would solve it would be by lowering a God character into the play to seemingly magically take care of a problem. This was called the God from the machine, or the Deus Ex Machina. Dietrich Bonhoeffer referred to the God we want as a Deus Ex Machina. Okay? This is a man who is a prisoner of the Nazis, who's executed by the Nazis, who's seen real suffering. He's a brilliant theologian and pastor and knows a little bit about what he's talking about. Let me read you this quote from him. He says, "Religious people speak of God when human knowledge, perhaps simply because they are too lazy to think, has come to an end, or when human resources fail. In fact, it is always the Deus Ex Machina that they bring onto the scene, either for the apparent solution of insoluble problems or as strength in human failure. Always, that is to say, exploiting human weakness or human boundaries." That's the God we want, and you can understand why we want a God like this. Several 100,000 years of human suffering, of dying in our 20s for years. I mean, really just up until like maybe a century ago, things weren't all that great, guys. I mean, life expectancy, not so long. Toothaches, it's not a matter of calling the dentist and having it taken care of. Diarrhea, it's not a matter of it's a matter of dying. I mean, things were like pretty bleak up until somewhat recently. Thousands and thousands of years of human suffering. We already have God figures in our minds that we've created as explanations for naturally occurring phenomenon. Now, when we find ourselves in this place of suffering, we're no doubt going to imbue these God figures we have with these superpowers to save us from our struggles. And so these are the sorts of gods we've come up with. Gods who always break in at the last moment, provided that you offer the sacrifice correctly, perform the ritual correctly, fast in the right manner, pray in the right manner, or believe the right way or something. So whenever it fails, whenever the Deus Ex Machina fails, there's always a reason why it failed, isn't there? We didn't pray the right way, we didn't fast the right way, we didn't believe the right way, or somebody else didn't believe the right way, or whatever. Something went awry somewhere. You get what I'm saying? There's always an explanation for why it didn't work. But the truth is, it doesn't work because that isn't the sort of God we have. The sort of God is the God who has revealed himself in Jesus, who is a God who himself experiences the trauma of godlessness. Not in order to ensure us that we never will, but in order to ensure us that when we do, he's with us. See, I don't, listen, I'm not saying I don't believe God intervenes. I'm not saying I don't believe God breaks in. Of course, I do think things like that happen, but let's just say, as a rule, it typically doesn't happen the way that we want it to happen, does it? I mean, will you be honest enough to admit that with me? Without fearing that you're going to speak doubt and curse yourself, because you're not. That isn't necessarily the sort of God we have or the sort of God we see. And again, we can believe we're the one generation in which there's going to be a prophetic truth revealed, and we're going to discover something no other generation discovered. In which case, why are we more significant than hundreds of thousands of years of humans before us? It's not going to happen. Exactly. It's Gnostic, where there's some secret special revelation reserved for us that no other had. It's generational exceptionalism. It's not in line with the character of God. The fact is, we don't have a God like the one we want. We have a God who's better than that. The God we have is the God who reveals himself in Jesus, who's not a deus ex machina, but who's something else entirely, something much more beautiful. Let me read you this quote from John Caputo from his book, The Insistence of God. He says, "The otherworldly testimony to this otherworldly call is our response. It insists we exist. The existence of our response is the only way the insistence of the call acquires existence or makes an appearance in the world. When I speak of the insistence of God, I mean that God does not exist or subsist, but that God insists. While it is the world that exists, the name of God is the name of an insistent call or solicitation that is visited upon the world. And whether God comes to exist depends upon whether we resist or assist this insistence. The insistence of God means that God insists upon existing. God is an insistent claim or provocation, while the business of existence is up to us. Existence here meaning response or responding, assuming responsibility to convert what is being called for in the name of God into a deed. 1 John 4:11-12, we read, "Beloved, since God loved us so much, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us and his love is perfected in us." Yeah. What Caputo says is that God does not exist in the way that we think God exists. It's not that God exists in the world as a substantial figure who's going to break through the wall like the Kool-Aid Man to save the day or like Captain America to save the day. That isn't the way that God exists. The way that God exists is through our response to his insistent call to love. We love because he first loved us. Brethren, since God loves us so much, we ought to love one another. There is this call of love that predates us, that is calling and insisting on coming into existence. And when we respond to this insistent call of the love of God, a God who is love gains existence in the world. How? No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us. And love is perfected in us. It's not just that God's like a little cloud zooming around the planet, zapping things and making things right. God is this insistent call of love. God is love. It's a call that predates us. And when you and when I hear it, and when we respond to that which insists, it comes to exist in reality. It becomes tangible and it becomes real when we assist the insistence of God and bring it into existence. So in situations like this, listen, there are places where God does not exist. Why? Because no one is assisting the insistence, bringing it into existence. There is not mutual recognition between subjects that the other matters. And so the character qualities of God are not coming into existence in that moment. And so we get broken relationships. We get crucifixions, out of which Jesus can rightly cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And yet at the same time, God is standing with him there. God is present with him. And it's the job of the church, by looking at Jesus, to understand that wherever there is a cry of godlessness, that is where God is standing. And in those moments, our responsibility is to bring the insistent into existence. Wherever we detect absence, that is precisely where there is presence. But presence alone doesn't change the situation. It's only when we detect that this is where God is standing, and we stand there as well, and we bring the insistent into existence, that things actually change and move forward. Listen to this. I don't know. Is this making sense at all? I'm having a lot of fun. I don't know. All right. Listen, Colossians 1:24-25. Just listen to this. Paul says, "I am now rejoicing in my sufferings for your sake. And in my flesh," listen, just listen. Just how offensive is this to our modern finished works interpretation of the gospel? Just listen. "I am now rejoicing in my sufferings for your sake. And in my flesh, I am completing what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, that is the church." What? What? I mean, it's finished. Jesus paid it all. What could possibly be lacking in regards to Christ's affliction. Paul says, I became its servant, the church's servant, according to God's commission that was given to me for you to make the word of God fully known, to make the person of Jesus fully known. What is he saying? He's saying, look, the cross happened. But what that means, what it speaks, what it communicates, what God is doing through that event does not exist in this situation. We still find ourselves in situations where this does not exist. It's constantly insisting on existing because that love is always calling, always drawing, always compelling. It's always there, calling. But until we choose to fill up in our own flesh, in Paul's words, what is lacking in regards to Christ's afflictions, it all just remains potential. It's calling and it's insisting, but as long as we just say, oh, Jesus did it, I don't have to do anything. Listen, we say stuff like that because we've been so bogged down by legalistic Christianity that says your identity is found in what you do and all this kind of stuff that we can't even hear someone talk about doing something without it triggering like all this, PTSD, religious PTSD stuff in us. Like, oh, he said works, he said do. Listen, I'm not talking about that. Nothing even remotely close to that. Not a thing you do can bring you closer to God. Not a thing you do can take you further from him. You're in. You're included. God has become man in the person of Jesus. There is no separation. Period. But what happened there, the example set, the thing done, doesn't exist substantially everywhere. There are still places where God does not exist. Wherever there's a victim, wherever there's a battered wife crying out, wherever there is a people group crying out, saying, just acknowledge that we matter. Wherever that is present, there's an absence of God because there's a lack of mutual recognition among subjects that the other matters. It's our job to recognize this is where God is present because of what we see in the cross. And that which insists from the cross, we bring into existence by standing with those God is standing with. Even as in the exile, God leaves the temple and makes his way to where the exiles are in Babylon. And even as on the cross, the Holy of Holies is empty and God is present with Jesus on the cross, we have to make our way toward the suffering. We have to make our way toward the godless cry because that's where God is. And then we bring the God who is present into existence by assisting the insistence. In Galatians 6:17, Paul says, from now on, let no one make trouble for me, for I carry the marks of Jesus branded on my body. How did Paul's scars in his body for the church become the marks of Jesus? Because what he does for the sake of the church is how what God does in Christ comes to exist in the world. Otherwise, it's simply an insistent call. But until you and until I hear that and lovingly assist the insistence, it remains potential. God, in that sense, remains absent while present. Does that make sense? So, listen, you can't even get there if you have a version of the cross that just says, Jesus does it all, it's his final sacrifice that pays for everything. Those kind of doctrines make us totally miss the heart of what the gospel is about. The gospel isn't just about you believing that God's bloodlust has been satiated through one final, ultimate human sacrifice. The gospel is a call to give the insistent God in existence by following the example of Jesus, who gives him existence through the incarnation. When you and I follow that one, God comes to exist. Wherever you hear the cry of suffering, that cry is a prophecy that there is no God there. But it's equal parts prophecy of God's inexistence and prophecy of his insistence. And it's those cries we are to run to and bring into existence that which insists. So there are places where God does not exist, but those are precisely the places where he is present, calling us to give him existence. Does that make sense? That's what I had to say for tonight. And I don't know how we want to end this. I guess we could do like a few minutes. If anyone has any like, do like Q&A or anything like that. I feel like I ended kind of quick, and maybe I didn't. Maybe you don't feel that way at all, but I kind of do. So like, I don't know if that's okay. If we want to open it up for something like that. I don't call it Q&A because I don't have all the